I've recently made 5 procedural animations that are all meant to replicate the procedural style of the game Rain World. Here, I'm emulating a certain spear item from the game. It's interactive by using an empty, so I can rotate and move it as I want. And along with its rotation, the dropping cloth actually counter-rotates in the exact same way, giving it the effect of a falling bit of cloth. I've also animated some slight displacement over time to make it look like the wind is affecting it. I do have arbitrary control of the pixel size, but I do my best to match the pixel size of the game. And as you can likely tell because of the simplicity of the shader, this was the first pixel art animation I made. The other 4 are all quite a bit more complex. Here's the second animation I made. It's a certain item from the game that pops into a bubble, which I had to fully emulate using noise. I'm once again using a snapping system to get the pixelated look. So yeah, there's about 3 parts to this shader. One is this simple rock shape, which you can get simply by using some vector math. Using length nodes will give you spherical gradients that you can use less than operations on to get sharp circles. Here I'm manipulating the vector slightly to stretch it out and rotate it. I repeated the process to get the little blue circle inside of it, and then used noise all over to add variation and make it look natural. I then added this diagonal line, which I used noise to displace as if it was falling down, and have it interact with the bubble in a realistic way. But the bubble itself was pretty fun to make, and it might actually be simpler than you expect. From our length node, we can extract tons of masks, like this one. If we invert that mask and cut it off by the edges, we can use it as a mix factor for a darker color. This will be the edges of our bubble. From here, the rest is just using masks. So I'm darkening and brightening certain parts to give it a realistic feel. This is the value mask for the bubble, so you can see how it's darkening this side. Here we have the glare effect that we can see on the bubble. All I'm doing here is adding to the value of the bubble, which is basically the brightness, using a cutoff version of this mask, which is formed from a radial gradient texture. And this isn't the only way to do it, of course. You can make spherical or rectangular glares on the bubble, using some other nodes if you want. One thing I like about using the gradient texture is that I can choose how many bits of glare I have. To keep it realistic, I kept it to 2 instead of 3 or 4. I can also change the thickness of these highlights, making them very thin for certain reflections, or make them cover a large amount of the bubble, which I thought was unrealistic. In these earlier shaders, I'm actually hand animating certain parts. Here I'm hand animating the blend between this rock and the bubble, for it to transform. While we're this close up on the animation, we can actually see some squash and stretch on the bubble. This goes by so quickly that you can almost only see it frame by frame. But I think it adds a lot more impact to the transformation. And once the bubble interacts with this leftover vine, I'm just increasing the displacement strength of the noise so that it goes side to side more, getting out of the way of the bubble. In this case, I'm also lowering the thickness, and because the pixels are thicker than the line it's trying to draw, they do just disappear almost randomly. There are a few small details I added, like the smaller blue disc getting slightly larger and glowing brighter before it transforms, and like I said, the squash and stretch. But besides the bubble, the whole shader is pretty simple. Here I'm emulating the pipe system shown in the game, and while there isn't much interaction going on, the shader itself is a lot bigger than the last 2. One of the most fun parts of making the shader was this mask. This thing is entirely procedural, so I can control the dimensions of the individual dots, or the spacing between them, and I have a floored system that allows me to change the number of cells for each line. This does stretch out the cells individually, but you can account for that by changing the multiply here. So I kept this value, keeping in mind that it should look similar to the game, and made multiple masks for getting a darkened section around it. This is supposed to make it look like a hole inside of the plane. I can change its brightness right here. But having these cells isn't enough to make this animation. How did I make this passing phase of the cells fully procedurally? When seeing this mask, it might look pretty separate from the actual shader, but this is actually the system I'm using to light up the certain cells. It all comes from this floored gradient, which I'm using a compare node on to select certain parts. And I've set it up so that as I increase this value, it'll slide along the cells. So if you're not familiar with drivers, this purple system isn't a keyframe, but it's actually using the frame progression to increase this value in the compare node. And as it does that, like I said, the white cells pass along the pipe. It creates this illusion of something passing through. And explaining this gradient system might be a little jarring, but all you need to know is that I've set it up and rotated gradients so that as it progresses, it increases in value constantly. And that's about all there is to this procedural animation. And while sure, the shader does look a bit complicated, the building blocks of the shader are all very simple. But if even this is too easy for you, don't worry, because we've got 2 more of the most complex animations I made. Here's the fourth animation I have. This one is from a plant in the game. So this has a lot of systems in it. I'll first explain how I made this flower looking pattern. When making this shader, I knew the goal was to have a mask that looks something like this, and I'll explain exactly why in a second. But before I explain why I had this goal, I'll explain exactly how I got to this strange flower shape. As you might have guessed by both the visuals and the naming style for each petal, I've separated all 7 petals from each other, and one by one, they're not all that complicated. Here in the first one, all I'm doing is using this distance node fed into a less than node with a low threshold. And I repeated a similar process for the second petal. This too is made from this distance gradient. But even before stretching out its coordinates, I'm rotating it with this vector rotate node, and that angle gives us a jagged edge on the pixel art. I actually used some masks here to change a few pixels independently, but that level of detail isn't necessary, and there's all kinds of ways to do it. By now, you might even recognize the process I'm using. I start off by translating or moving the petal using a subtract node. This is basically just moving over the coordinates to a location I want. Then I'm rotating these coordinates using a certain system, stretching them out by multiplying them, and using distance to get an elliptical gradient, which might look a bit more complicated, but what I'm basically using is just a normal length node, if you're familiar with it. So from this, we get to this gradient, and I'm removing the gradient with a less than node to actually define the shape of the petal. And I'm using this pattern of moving, rotating, and stretching over and over, and that's why you'll see the same 4 nodes used almost every petal, along with some secondary tweaks to the petal itself. I repeated this process for petal 4, petal 5, petal 6, and 7, and when they're all added together, they define this flower shape. But this, to me, isn't really useful. That's why I've separated every petal from one another, and added them using mixed nodes, so the masks don't interfere with one another, and then assigned a value from least to greatest to each one of them. And this is structured in a very specific way. It's done so I can mix between green and blue, and it's mixing just according to this gradient that we have. And while these values do look a bit random, I am entirely basing it off my reference images for the game. So after I mix these effectively, we get the shader for the flower. But there's so much more than just the flower effect going on in this shader. So before I explain how I made the bottom part of this shader, I'll just show how I made this fake water simulation. All I'm really using is this gradient, which is shifted up and down according to a sine wave. But beneath the water's surface, I've simulated the base of the flower. In-game, these are very murky and grayed out. So all I did was make this shape with some vector math. I've curved the end of it at the bottom to emulate the look in-game, and added this vine separately, which is simulated to wrap all the way around. Obviously, this won't be visible above the water, so I made it very grayed out and hard to see as it nears the water's surface. I then added some light beneath the surface emitted by the flower, and the fall off of the light here is actually affected by Voronoi. On top of that, I shifted this Voronoi downwards constantly with the frame driver to make the water feel cloudy and volumetric. But besides that, I barely needed to use noise in the shader. And lastly, one of my favorite parts of the shader is the light. As I mentioned before, we're mixing between green and a certain color. I based this blue off of my reference picture over here. But there's nothing telling us we can't make it another color. So I've added this color wheel for us to select any one we want. And because it's all procedural, it does run perfectly in the shader. But this color wheel actually affects a lot more than just the color of the flower. It shifts the color of all of the gradient light sources around it. That means if I make it a very saturated purple magenta, the surrounding water will adopt the same color. But we're not done yet, because there's actually one other system I added just a few minutes before recording this video. It's this opening animation, which I made by just rotating all of the petals by the frame count. But you can also control this manually if you want. And if you look at it very closely, you'll see that at its closed state, it emits almost no light. But when opened, the sphere of light actually adjusts accordingly. So there's quite a bit of interaction between the water and this color. And it can be used to emulate the other looks that the flower has in-game. And now that we're zoomed out looking at the shader, we can actually see that there are no hand-animated sliders. Everything here is animated by the frame data, which means we can control almost every interaction using just some add nodes, which can become a little difficult on big shaders if you're using hand-animated values. But yeah, I'd say for a shader this big, one of the biggest takeaways is understanding how to use gradients, especially in ways you might not usually think about. Now don't worry, I don't think the next shader is more advanced than this one, but it does use some tools in ways you might not expect. Here's the animation. So as you can tell, there's two main parts to the shader. I'll first explain how I made these white objects that orbit the center. These little guys are individually made up of tools you probably are very familiar with. I am using node groups for each of them, which makes the shader a little more compact. But if we see certain parts of the shader, it really is all formed from gradients. This is what we're making right before using the less than operation, and we can even separate this into its smaller parts. Most of the object is actually just this length gradient. We're then using a minimum node to lower the values of this gradient in just certain parts to make it look like it has a body. And with this top gradient, we create the two legs that sprout from the body. These legs are made using the local x gradient, which I'm using absolute nodes and all kinds of other operations to get this effect. But the reason I said local x and not global x is because local x will follow this object as it rotates. So if I rotate the body in a certain way, the legs will follow the body. But how am I rotating these three separate parts of the shader without keyframes? The easy way to do this would be to assign each object one of these rotating empties, and doing this 3 times for each one. But obviously I didn't use an empty for the shader, and just looking at the nodes certainly won't explain this enough. So here I'll give you a visual demonstration. The very basic concept behind this orbiting path has to do with a sine wave. If you're unfamiliar, we can use sine waves in drivers like this, and we can control both the amplitude and frequency of the sine wave by just adjusting our initial instructions. And if we repeat the exact same process for the y position of this circle, we get this diagonal oscillation, which is really not helpful. But by swapping from sine to cosine, the phase in these waves switches in the perfect way to get this orbiting look. But if you've taken any trigonometry classes, I'm sure you're very familiar with this, and I haven't surprised you at all. But this whole orbiting transformation is only positional. So we're basically just sliding this circle around without rotating it at all. To demonstrate that further, I'll actually stretch out the circle vertically. But if we add our frame information to the rotation of the object, it stays in a constant rotation along its path. Now obviously this doesn't look like a streamlined motion, but if we add half of pi to it, which is half of a full rotation in radians, it now looks like it really is orbiting the center, albeit very quickly and unrealistically. But the beauty of this system is that we can change and multiply any part of it to tweak the path that it follows in its orbit, in which it only takes one value node with a driver so that you can tweak the pace at any time. But now that we understand how to get this effect, we can apply it to each individual object in the shader. And I did this 3 times, adjusting the speed variation and rotational variation for each of these objects. On top of that, I'm actually squishing or stretching the legs, which is done fully with the frame count and not hand animated. But now that you know a bit more about how the orbiting guys work, I'll explain how the object in the center was made. It all starts with this mask, which is just a normal spherical gradient with 2 big chunks subtracted out of the mask on both sides of the circle. I'm then using this mask to scale this texture. And by scale, I mean scale the vectors of it. So if we take this texture, which I'll explain in a second, and multiply it by this mask, it will not show the texture wherever this mask isn't. But how did we get this original mask? Before I even explain how it works, you can already identify the main systems. We have a length system on the left that gives us this circular highlight, and the way we find this blue strip is by separating the x-axis, which is the foundation for the ring that we see inside of the ball. And right after this effect is made, it's overlaid on top of the slightly bluish gradient. So now we have all these objects from the game interacting in a single shader, and the whole thing is powered by drivers. And I think that finally concludes these 5 shaders, ranging from pretty simple to very complex. And before I go, here's a comparison between my references and my final shaders. And with that, thanks for watching. These shaders were a ton of fun to make, and I made them over months. And I really hope you see the progression of my skills as they ramp up both in complexity and ambition. And with that, bye.